So I've got a really weird one for you today. Smallpox. Most of us think we kind of know the history of smallpox, but we're wrong. First off, smallpox was a horrendous disease. We are so lucky to live in a time when it is firmly in the past. The World Health Assembly declared their worldwide eradication of smallpox in 1980. But honestly, most of the world had been living without fear of this disease since Dr. Edward Jenner had published his findings of his vaccination back in 1801. Now, Dr. Jenner was brilliant and worthy of praise. His vaccination was a true gift to humanity. But it's not the whole story. Over thousands of years across the globe, smallpox killed hundreds of millions of people. The rich, the poor, the young, the old, even in the towers of royalty, there was no escape. It did not discriminate. It killed over 1/3 of all people infected, and sometimes even more in the more severe forms of the disease. The symptoms of smallpox were gruesome, beginning with high fever, vomiting, and mouth sores, followed by fluid-filled bubbling blisters and lesions covering the entire body. These were painful, disgusting sores that allowed the sufferer no way to get comfortable or to rest. Unrelenting pain, coupled with the psychological horror of being locked in a body as it curdled alive. And then you die. The process of the disease was swift. You would often be dead within 2 weeks of contracting the disease. Or, if you were a lucky survivor, you could be left with permanent blindness, infertility, or disfiguring scars. Smallpox was, understandably, quite terrifying. And not only because of the horror of the disease itself, but because it was also highly infectious. Historians have found examples of smallpox as early as 1350 BCE. These were found in Egyptian mummies. Humanity had been engaged with an ongoing battle with smallpox for thousands of years. But the people of some regions in the world had found a way to fight back. And they found it a surprisingly long time ago. Across many different cultures, some very clever people discovered if you take a little bit of the material of a pustule from an infected person, and then you put it into the skin of a healthy person through a small incision, that person would get a more mild form of smallpox that, when they fought it off, would then give them immunity against the full smallpox disease. This process has been called variolation, inoculation, engrafting, transplanting, or rather whimsically, sewing the pox. The true origin of inoculation is not known, but we know from several sources that it's been practiced since ancient times by many peoples around the world, with documentation going back as early as 200 BCE. In China, there are written accounts from the 16th century describing a form of inoculation called insufflation, where they would take the smallpox scabs and they would grind them up, and then they would blow them into the nose of a healthy person through a pipe. In India, similar practices were carried out using a lancet or a needle to take the material from the smallpox sore and then prick it into the skin of healthy children. And sources from the 18th century say that this practice was going on hundreds of years even before that. And for the Northeast Shore and of Georgia, this technique was said to have been practiced from time immemorial by those who lived there wanting to protect their reputed beauty. There was so many cultures engaged in a really practical way to prevent smallpox epidemics. How come this information didn't reach Western medicine until 1721? But what's of particular interest to us about the story of smallpox in Western Europe is who was credited with the introduction of this new knowledge and who was not. Even at the time, historians fought over who should get credit for introducing smallpox inoculation to the West. Should it be the learned graduates of Padua University who published the first papers on inoculation? Should it be Sloane and Charles Maitland, who were the royal physician and royal surgeon? They oversaw the first inoculations in the West. Or should it be Lady Mary Montagu, who brought the practice with her to England after observing its success in Turkey, where her husband was stationed as an ambassador? Lady Mary had been struck by smallpox herself. Her eyelashes were gone and her face was deeply pitted. Her brother had died of the disease. What's important about Lady Mary's contribution to the inoculation story is she was a lady of high birth who publicly submitted her own children to the procedure in England. After that led to Princess Caroline's 2 daughters also being inoculated. After these aristocratic seals of approval, the rest of the country followed eagerly. This kind of PR cannot be accomplished by a lone physician. Lady Mary can be held up as a trailblazer for a practice that eventually became standard medicine across Europe and the colonies. Her bold publicity for the practice was an amazing act that had a huge impact on public health. But focusing on Lady Mary's contribution is only coming in midway through the story. All of these discovery narratives, whether they're university men or trained physicians or Lady Mary, all of them focus on Europeans as a conduit for knowledge that's coming into Europe. But none of them actually focus on where this knowledge originated in the first place. And the credit for Lady Mary's part in this story should probably go to a group of Greek women who kept the practice of inoculation alive in the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, we don't have the names for these women, of course. They're referred to in the notes by European men as nameless, shadowy actors, footnotes in their own discoveries. Of these unnamed women, there was one in particular. She was said to have inoculated anywhere from 4,000 to up to 6,000 people during a particularly bad epidemic in Constantinople in 1706. Known only as the Greek woman of Moria, which is today the Peloponnese Peninsula, she practiced her inoculation technique primarily on the lower classes. But as epidemic threatened, suddenly inoculation became fashionable in the noble families, especially the English, Dutch, and French merchants who were living in the area. Evidence suggests that this Greek woman might be the same old woman that Lady Mary asked to inoculate her son. She used a needle in a nutshell, and this practice of inoculation was called sewing the pox. While this particular woman didn't invent sewing the pox, she and others like her kept this ancient knowledge alive through her practice. The French explorer and historian of inoculation, Charles Marie de la Condamine, wrote in 1756 of women in 3 other cities in Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria who also practiced this art. From the similarity of practices across the Mediterranean basin and Central Asia into Africa, where the only difference is they would tie 3 pins together to use to puncture the skin, the Condamine deduced that this information actually came from the North Black Sea and came down into Cairo through slaves sold into Egypt's militia. From there, it was thought to have traveled to Tripoli, Tunis, Algeria, and the interior of Africa. During the transatlantic slave trade, captured Africans carried this knowledge across the Atlantic into the Americas, with several enslaved healers imparting this knowledge to their enslavers. So bizarrely, at the same time that Lady Mary is learning about inoculation from Greek women in Istanbul, physicians in New England are learning it from enslaved African healers, and it all happened in the same year, 1721. Despite being the actual last healers on the planet to learn of this cure, which you think might engender a bit of bashful humiliation, physicians in both England and New England did not like the prominent role that women played in the inoculation story. A physician at St. Bart's Hospital in London, an ardent anti-inoculist named William Wagstaff, best name ever, he was aghast, and he said, quote, "It's shocking that an experiment practiced by only a few ignorant women amongst illiterate and unthinking people should on a sudden, and upon a slender experience, so far obtain in one of the politest nations in the world as to be received into the royal palace." And in New England, Boston physician Zabadiel Boyston said this important procedure should not be left to, quote, "old women and nurses, but to be taken over and managed by good physicians and surgeons. Only if physicians and surgeons were not available, only then could women inoculate." And it's funny, though of course not surprising, that even though inoculation came from women who had literally been practicing it for hundreds of years, by the time this practice did finally trundle its way to the West, women were the very people who were not considered even qualified to perform it. So yes, I say thank you, Dr. Jenner. I say thank you, Lady Mary. But honestly, thank you, old Greek women. Thank you, old Indian women. Thank you, old Chinese women. Thank you, old African women. Thank you. And if you'd like to learn more about the hidden histories of women in medicine, please come by my exhibition this summer at the Museum of the Home in London. It's titled Women's Weeds. I literally have so much of this stuff. Come check it out.